I was standing in the boardroom on the 47th floor of Goldman Sachs, with my hand literally shaking as I held the pen over the signature line that would make me the youngest female managing director in the firm's history when my phone buzzed, and I saw his name light up the screen. And in that split second, I knew I was about to throw away everything I owned. Dee spent 28 years building for a 29-year-old man who drove a Toyota Camry with 200,000 miles on it and had exactly $312 in his checking account. And you know what the craziest part is? I didn't even hesitate. I put the pen down. I looked at the 8 men in $5,000 suits staring at me like I'd lost my mind. And I walked out, and I never looked back. And before I tell you how a 52-year-old woman with a corner office on Wall Street and a 7-figure salary ended up choosing a guy who made $15 an hour, plus tips, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and comment below where you're watching this from. Because what happened next is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about love and age and what actually matters in this life. So subscribe. And let me tell you how it really started, because it wasn't some fairy tale. It was messy and complicated. And it cost me almost everything. But I'd do it again in a heartbeat. So 6 months before that boardroom moment, I was working my usual 18-hour day. And it was 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, and I'd just closed a deal worth $42 million. And I was exhausted down to my bones, the kind of tired where your eyes burn and your body feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. And I ordered an Uber to take me from the office to my penthouse in Tribeca. And when the car pulled up, I barely looked at the driver. I just collapsed into the back seat with my Prada briefcase, and my phone still buzzing with emails. And I heard this voice say, "You look like you could use some music." And before I could say no thank you, I just want silence, he turned on this song I'd never heard before, something soft and acoustic. And somehow in my exhausted state, it made me want to cry. And I looked up at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw his eyes for the first time. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but I'm telling you, there was something in those eyes, dark brown, almost black. And they had this kindness in them that I hadn't seen in years working in finance, where everyone eyes are calculating what they can get from you. And he said, "My name is Marcus, by the way, and I know you probably don't care. But I wrote that song," and I just nodded, because I didn't have the energy to respond. But something about his voice, something about the way the streetlights hit his face as we drove through the empty Manhattan streets, something made me actually look at him. And he was beautiful, not in the polished Wall Street way I was used to, but in this raw, unfinished way, like a painting that wasn't done yet. And he had this scar above his left eyebrow, and his hands on the steering wheel were calloused, like he actually worked with them. And I found myself staring at those hands longer than I should have. And then he said, "You know, most people I drive at this hour are either drunk or miserable. And you don't smell like alcohol, so I'm guessing miserable." And I don't know why, but instead of giving him the cold corporate brush off I'd perfected over the years, I laughed. And I said, "Both actually, I'm miserable, and I wish I was drunk." And he laughed, too, and said, "Well, I can't help with the drunk part, but if you want, I know a place that makes the best coffee in the city, and it's open 24 hours, and something in me, something I didn't even know existed anymore, said yes." And how I ended up at 3 in the morning in a tiny coffee shop in the East Village, sitting across from my Uber driver. And I learned that Marcus was 29 years old, which made him exactly 23 years younger than me. Not that I was thinking about that yet. And he'd moved to New York from Michigan 3 years ago to pursue music, and he drove Uber to pay rent on a studio apartment in Bushwick, that cost him $1,900 a month, and he played guitar at open mic nights and wrote songs that nobody listened to and worked on his album that would probably never get released. And as he talked, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a conversation with someone who actually cared about what they were doing, who had passion instead of ambition. And there's a difference. Ambition is about winning, about beating other people, but passion is about creating something that matters. And I'd spent so long in the world of ambition that I'd forgotten passion even existed. And when he asked me what I did, I almost lied because I was tired of the way people looked at me when I said I worked in finance, like I was either intimidating or corrupt or both. But I told him the truth. And he just nodded and said, "That must be intense." And I said, "You have no idea." And he said, "Do you like it?" And nobody had asked me that in years. They asked how much I made or what deals I'd closed or who I knew. But nobody asked if I knew. I actually liked it. And I opened my mouth to say, yes, of course I like it. I'm successful, I'm respected, I'm powerful. But what came out instead was, I don't know anymore. And his eyes softened, and he said, "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in months." And I felt something crack open inside my chest. Something I'd been keeping locked away for so long, I'd forgotten it was there. And we talked until 5 a.m, and when he finally drove me home, the sun was coming up over the East River, and everything looked golden and new. And he said, "Can I see you again?" And I should have said no. I should have thanked him for the coffee and gone inside and forgotten about him. But instead, I gave him my number, and I said, "Yes, I'd like that." And as I rode the elevator up to my apartment, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls, and I barely recognized myself because I was smiling, really smiling. Not the professional smile I'd perfected for client meetings, but a genuine smile that reached my eyes. And I thought, what am I doing? This is insane. He's 29 years old. I'm 50, too. He drives for Uber. I run a hedge fund. This is never going to work. But then my phone buzzed, and it was a text from him. And all it said was, "Thank you for tonight." And I smiled again. And I thought, maybe insane is exactly what I need right now. Because Safe and Sensible had left me exhausted and alone at 3 a.m, ordering Uber rides from a job I wasn't even sure I loved anymore. And that was the beginning. And I know you're probably thinking, this is where it gets romantic, where we start dating and fall in love and everything works out. But that's not what happened at all. Because 2 days later, I was in a partner meeting and they announced they were considering me for managing director. And this was everything I'd worked for my entire career. I'd started at Goldman Sachs right out of business school 28 years ago. I was one of 3 women in my analyst class, and I'd watched most of them leave for easier careers, or as to start families while I stayed. I worked the 100-hour weeks. I sacrificed relationships and friendships and sleep. I proved myself over and over again in a world that didn't want women at the table. And now, finally, after all those years, they were offering me a seat, not just at the table, but at the head of it. And I should have been ecstatic. But all could think about was Marcus and that coffee shop and the way he'd asked me if I liked my job and the fact that I hadn't been able to answer. And I went home that night to my penthouse that cost me $12,000 a month. And I looked around at the designer furniture and the art I'd bought because my decorator said it was a good investment. The view of the Hudson River that I'd stopped noticing years ago, and I felt nothing. And then my phone buzzed, and it was Marcus asking if I wanted to come hear him play at an open mic night in Brooklyn. And I said yes, even though I had a 7 a.m. meeting the next morning, even though Brooklyn felt like another planet compared to my life in Tribeca, even, though every logical part of my brain was screaming that this was a mistake. And I showed up at this tiny bar in Williamsburg that smelled like beer and had sticky floors, and there were maybe 15 people there, and Marcus was on stage with his guitar. And when he started singing, I felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years. I felt moved. I felt something real and raw. And when he looked at me while he sang, I felt seen, truly seen, not as a managing director or a deal maker or a woman in a power suit, but just as me as Sarah. And after his set, he came over and said, "What did you think?" And I said, "That was beautiful." And he said, "I wrote it about you." And my heart stopped because nobody had ever written a song about, nobody had ever thought I was worth writing about. I was the woman who made things happen, who closed deals, who made money. But I wasn't the woman who inspired songs. And I said, "You barely know me." And he said, "I know enough. I know you're brilliant and exhausted and lonely, and you're pretending you're not. And I know there's something inside you that wants to break free." And I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't because he was right. And that terrified me, and we started seeing each other after that in secret, because I couldn't explain to my colleagues why I was dating someone who made less than a year than I made in a week. I couldn't explain to my friends who'd all married doctors and lawyers and investment bankers why I was dating a musician who drove Uber, and I definitely couldn't explain it to my mother, who'd spent my entire childhood telling me the only way to be safe as a woman was to be financially independent and successful. And here I was falling for someone who had nothing, at least nothing, that my world valued, but he had something my world had lost. He had joy and purpose and passion. And when I was with him, I remembered what it felt like to be alive. Really, alive. Not just going through the motions, not just chasing the next deal, the next promotion, the next dollar, but actually living. And we'd meet late at night after my work events and his gigs, and we'd walk through the city, and he'd show me places I'd never noticed, even though I'd lived in New York for 3 decades. Little parks tucked between buildings, street art on warehouse walls, bakeries that opened at 4 a.m. for the early shift workers. And it was like he was showing me a completely different New York than the one I'd been living in all these years. My New York was boardrooms and penthouse, offices and expensive restaurants where you needed a reservation 3 months in advance. His New York was dive bars and poetry readings and bodega cats, and somehow his felt more real. And during the day, I'd be in meetings talking about quarterly earnings and market projections, and I'd catch myself thinking about him, thinking about the way he'd kissed me the night before in the rain outside a subway station, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only person in the world. And I'd realize I'd completely lost track of the conversation, and my colleagues would look at me like I'd grown second head, because I never lost focus. I was known for being sharp and present and ruthless. And now I was daydreaming in board meetings like a teenager. And then came the night everything changed. We'd been seeing each other for 4 months in this weird secret limbo, and he asked me to come to his apartment for the first time. And I said yes, even though I was nervous, because what if seeing how he lived made it too real? What if I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just a fun distraction? And his apartment was a studio in Bushwick, 4th floor walk-up, and it was smaller than my master bedroom. But when I walked in, I was struck by how much it felt like a home. He had plants everywhere, actual living plants, that he took care of, not the expensive ones my decorator had bought, that I watered once a month. If I remembered, he had Books stacked on every surface, poetry and philosophy and music theory. He had guitars lined up against the wall, and a keyboard and recording equipment cobbled together from what looked like secondhand finds, and there were photos tacked to the walls, pictures of him with friends at concerts, pictures of landscapes from his hometown in Michigan, a picture of his mom who'd died when he was 21. And when I saw that picture, I understood something about him. I understood why he lived the way he did, why he chose passion over security, because life was short and unpredictable, and he'd learned that lesson young. And he made me dinner pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market and cheap red wine, and we sat on his floor because he only had one chair, and he played me the song he'd been working on, and it was about second chances and starting over and finding yourself when you thought you were already too far gone. And I started crying. I actually cried for the first time in years. And he held me, and I told him things I'd never told anyone. I told him about how I'd spent my whole life trying to prove I was good enough, trying to earn my place in rooms that didn't want me there. Told him about the price I'd paid, the relationships I'd destroyed, the parts of myself I'd buried to succeed. I told him I was 52 years old, and I had everything I'd ever wanted professionally, and I'd never been more miserable. And he said, "Then why do you keep doing it?" And I said, "Because I don't know how to stop, because this is who I am." And he said, "No, this is what you do. It's not who you are." And he was right. But I didn't know what to do with that information, because if I wasn't a managing director at Goldman Sachs, if I wasn't closing $40 million deals, if I wasn't the woman in the power suit with the corner office, then who was I? And I started spending more time with him, skipping work events that I would have killed for invitations. 2 years ago, showing up late to meetings for the first time in my career, leaving my phone in my bag for hours at a time, and my colleagues noticed. My assistant asked if I was feeling okay. My boss asked if everything was all right at home, and I said yes, everything's fine. But it wasn't fine because I was falling in love with Marcus, and it was terrifying because love meant vulnerability, meant giving someone the power to hurt you, and I'd spent my entire adult life making sure nobody had that power over me. But with Marcus, I couldn't help it. I couldn't protect myself, and I didn't want to. And then one night at 3 a.m., after we'd made love in his tiny apartment with the sounds of the city floating through the open window, he said, "I love you," and my heart stopped because I knew I loved him, too. But saying it made it real, and real meant I had to make a choice. And I said, "I love you, too." And he said, "So what are we doing here?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Sarah, I'm in love with you. I want to be with you, really be with not hiding, not sneaking around. But I need to know if you're serious about this, because I can't keep being your secret." And he was right, and I knew it. But the thought of telling people about us, the thought of my colleagues finding out, the thought of my mother's reaction, the thought of walking into Goldman Sachs with him by my side, him in his thrift store jeans and band t-shirts. While I wore Armani, it felt impossible. And I said, "I need time." And his face fell, and he said, "Okay, but Sarah, I need you to know I'm all in. I'm not playing games here. I know I don't have money. I know I'm not what you're supposed to want. But I love you, and I think you love me too. And if that's not enough, then tell me now, because I can't do this halfway." And I went home that night, and I couldn't sleep. And I kept thinking about what he'd said about being all in, about loving me. And I realized I'd never had that. Nobody had ever loved me just for me. They loved my success, my money, my status. But Marcus loved me despite all that. He loved the person I was at 3 a.m. when I was tired and honest and stripped of all my armor. And the next day at work, I was distracted all through a crucial meeting with a client from Tokyo. I was thinking about Marcus, thinking about his words, thinking about the choice I had to make. And my boss pulled me aside after and said, "What's going on with you? You're not yourself." And I almost told him the truth. I almost said I'm in love with someone who makes me want to throw everything away. But instead I said, "I'm fine, just tired." And he said, "You need to get it together. We're voting on the managing director position next week." And I said, "I know." And he said, "This is what you've worked for. Don't lose it now." And I nodded. But all I could think was, maybe I don't want it anymore. And that thought terrified me. Because who was I if I wasn't chasing the next promotion, the next achievement? If you're still watching this story and you're wondering what I'm going to decide, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is going to shock you. And leave a comment telling me if you've ever had to choose between what you wanted and what you thought you should want. Because that's exactly where I was standing, at a crossroads between the life I'd built and the life I might want to have. And I had no idea which way to go. And then a week later, I got the call they wanted to see me in the boardroom. The partners had made their decision. And when I walked into that room on the 47th floor and saw the contract sitting on the table with my name on it, managing director, 7-figure salary, equity stake in the firm, I felt nothing, just numb. And they gave me the whole speech about how I'd earned it, how I was a role model, how they were lucky to have me. And all I could think was, this is supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Why do I feel like I'm at a funeral? And they handed me the Pen Mont Blanc, $15,000. I'd bought it specifically for this moment. And I held it over the signature line, and my hand was shaking. And I thought, if I sign this, I'm committing to this life forever. I'm committing to 18-hour days and board meetings and deals and being alone in my penthouse at 3 a.m. ordering Uber rides because I have nobody to go home to. And that's when my phone buzzed and I saw Marcus' name. And it wasn't even a message. It was just a notification that he'd posted something on Instagram, and I clicked it without thinking. And it was a video of him playing guitar and singing the song he'd written about me. And in the caption, he'd written, "Sometimes you meet someone who makes you believe in yourself again." And I looked at that video, and I looked at the contract, and I looked at the 8 men in $5,000 suits watching me, expecting me to sign. Put the pen down, and I said, "I can't do this." And you should have seen their faces. One of them said, "What do you mean? You can't do this." Another said, "Sarah, this is what you've worked for your entire career." And I said, "I know, but it's not what I want anymore." And I stood up and I walked out. And as I was leaving, my boss followed me into the hallway. And he said, "If you walk away from this, you're walking away from everything." And I said, "I know." And he said, "You'll regret this." And I said, "Maybe, but I'll regret staying more." And I took the elevator down 47 floors. And with each floor, I felt lighter, like I was shedding layers of armor I'd been wearing for so long. I'd forgotten they were there. And when I got to the lobby, I called Marcus. And when he answered, I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "I'm at my apartment." "Why?" And I said, "I'm coming over. I have something to tell you." And he said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Yes, everything's okay. I think everything's finally okay." And I took an Uber to his apartment in Bushwick. And when I got there, I was still in my business suit, my armor, and he opened the door and took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" And I said, "I didn't sign it." I walked away, and his eyes went wide, And he said, from the partnership. And I said, yes, from all of it. And he said, Sarah, are you serious? And I said, I'm serious. I love you, Marcus. I love you. And I don't want to hide it anymore. I don't want to pretend. And I don't want to spend my life chasing things that don't make me happy. And he pulled me inside, and he kissed me. And for the first time, in as long as I could remember, I felt free, really free. And he said, you know, this means we're probably going to end up broke, right? And I laughed and said, probably. And he said, and people are going to judge you and talk about you. And I said, let them. And he said, and your mother's going to hate me. And I said, definitely. And he said, and I still only have $312 in my checking account. And I said, I know. And he said, so why are you doing this? And I said, because you asked me if I liked my job and I couldn't answer you, and because you wrote me a song. And because when I'm with you, I remember who I used to be before I became what everyone else wanted me to be. And because I love you. And he said, I love you too. And that night we stayed up until dawn talking about what came next. And the truth is, I didn't know I'd given up my shot at being managing director at one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street. I'd probably tanked my reputation in the finance world, and I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. But for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't afraid of not knowing, and the next few months were hard. My colleagues stopped calling my mentor, the man who'd guided my career for 2 decades, told me I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. My mother cried actual tears when I told her I was dating Marcus, and she met him for the first time at a dinner I arranged, and she was cold and judgmental. And after he left, she said, he's using you, Sarah. You're 52 years old, with money, and he's 29 with nothing. What else could this be? And I said, it's love, Mom. And she said, you're being naive. And I said, maybe, but I'd rather be naive and happy than smart and miserable. And she didn't speak to me for 3 months, and my friends didn't understand either. They'd all stayed in their marriages to men who looked good on paper, men with the right jobs and the right last names and the right club memberships. And they looked at Marcus in his thrift store clothes with his musician dreams, and they couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't see his kindness, his depth, his passion. They just saw someone who didn't fit. And slowly, I lost most of those friendships because I couldn't pretend. I couldn't show up to their charity galas and make small talk about vacation homes and stock portfolios when I was spending my weekends at open mic nights in Brooklyn and volunteering at the community garden Marcus had started in his neighborhood. And the weird thing was, I didn't miss them. I didn't miss the life I'd left behind. And I started working as a consultant part-time, helping small businesses with their finances, and it didn't pay anywhere near what I'd made at Goldman Sachs. But it was enough. And more importantly, it felt meaningful. And I moved out of my $12,000 penthouse. And I got a smaller place in Brooklyn, a 2-bedroom with a terrace where Marcus and I could have breakfast in the morning sun. And it cost 1/3 of what I'd been paying. And it felt more like home than my Tribeca penthouse ever had. And Marcus moved in with me after 6 months. And I know that's fast. But when you're 52, you don't have time to waste. And my mother said I was crazy. And my former colleagues probably agreed. But I didn't care because I was happy, really, truly happy for the first time in decades. And yes, there were challenges. Marcus and I came from completely different worlds. I was used to 5-star restaurants. He was used to dollar pizza. I was used to flying business class. He never left the country. I had a retirement account worth $3.7 million. He had student loan debt from the music school he'd dropped out of after his mom died. And we had to figure out how to navigate those differences, how to build a life together when we had such different histories and resources. And sometimes it was hard. He'd get insecure about money, about the fact that I paid for most things. And I'd get frustrated when he didn't understand why. Certain professional opportunities mattered to me, and we had to learn how to talk about it, how to be honest about the uncomfortable stuff. And here's what I learned. Love doesn't erase differences. Love doesn't make everything easy, but love makes it worth it. Love makes you willing to do the work, to have the hard conversations, to compromise, to grow. And Marcus made me willing to do that work. And I'd been with men before, men who looked perfect on paper, men my mother approved of, men thought I should be with. But I'd never been with someone who made me want to be better, not richer, not more successful, but more honest, more present, more myself. And that was worth everything I'd given up. And 1 year after I walked out of that boardroom, Marcus asked me to marry him. He did it in the most Marcus way possible. No fancy restaurant, no elaborate setup, just the two of us on our terrace at sunset. And he said, "Sarah, I don't have much to offer you. I don't have money or status or any of the things you gave up when you chose me. But I have love, and I have music, and I have this garden we planted together, and I have all these tomorrows I want to spend with you." And I said yes, without hesitation. And we got married 3 months later in that same community garden, surrounded by the people from his neighborhood who'd become my friends too. People who didn't care that I used to work at Goldman Sachs. People who just knew me as Marcus's. Sarah and my mother came, and she cried. But this time, they were different tears. And she told me later that watching me with Marcus reminded her of who she'd been before. She'd spent her whole life being practical, being careful. And she said, I'm sorry I didn't understand." And I said, "It's okay. I didn't understand either until I met him. And now it's been 2 years since I walked out of that boardroom. 2 years since I chose love over a 7-figure salary. And people ask me if I ever regret it, if I miss my old life. If I ever wonder what would have happened if I'd signed that contract, and the answer, no, not even for a second, because I'd rather have love than money. I'd rather have Marcus than a managing director. Title, I'd rather have breakfast on our terrace and open mic nights in Brooklyn, and a life that feels real than anything my old world could have given me. And yes, we still have challenges. Marcus's music career is taking off slowly, and sometimes he gets opportunities that require him to travel. And I worry because I'm 54 now, and he's 31, and I know people look at us and think that won't last, and maybe they're right. Maybe we'll face struggles. I can't predict yet, but every day I wake up next to him and I choose him all over again, and he chooses me, and that's enough. And I learned something important through all of this. I learned that the things we think we want, the status, the money, the titles, those things aren't bad, but they can't fill the holes inside us. They can't make us happy if we're living someone else's idea of success. And I'd spent 52 years living my mother's idea of success, my colleagues' idea of success society's idea of what a powerful woman should be. And none of it had made me happy. And then I met Marcus, and he didn't care about any of that. He just saw me, and he loved me, and he gave me permission to want something different. And so if you're watching this and you're at your own crossroads, if you're standing somewhere wondering whether to choose what you want or what you think you should want, I'm here to tell you, choose what you want. Choose love. Choose joy. Choose the thing that makes you feel alive, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. because life is short and unpredictable. And you, Dawn, get unlimited chances to be happy. And I almost missed mine. I almost signed that contract. I almost chose safety over love. And I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. And now hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And leave a comment telling me your story. Have you ever chosen love over logic? Have you ever walked away from something everyone said you should want? I want to hear from you because these stories matter, because they remind us we're not alone in choosing differently. And before you go, I want to tell you one more thing. 6 months ago, Marcus got signed to a record label, a small indie one. But it's real. And his album is coming out next month. And he dedicated it to me. In the liner notes, he wrote for Sarah, who taught me that it's never too late to start over. And when I read that, I cried because he taught me the same thing. And that's the thing about real love. It changes you both. It makes you both better. And I'm not saying throw away your career or your ambitions. I'm not saying money doesn't matter or that everyone should date someone 23 years younger than them. I'm just saying pay attention to what makes you feel alive. Pay attention to who makes you want to be yourself. And if you find that, don't let it go. Don't let fear or judgment or what other people think talk you out of it, because I almost did. And it would have been the biggest mistake of my life, bigger than any deal I could have closed, bigger than any title I could have earned. And sitting here now in our apartment in Brooklyn, with Marcus in the other room, working on his music and the smell of coffee filling the air and the sound of the city waking up outside our window, I can tell you with absolute certainty that I made the right choice. I chose love, and love chose me back. And that's worth more than anything Goldman Sachs could have given me. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to choose yourself. And if you got value from this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.